What should we do then? What should we do then? Sounds like the kind of question that gets asked a lot when things like the school holidays start. What should we do then? Today we're looking at a book in this collection of books that we call the Bible. And it's a book called Luke. And Luke's collection of stories about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth were probably, we think, collected, or at least written down, about 30 years after his execution at the hands of the Roman Empire. We've seen in the first few chapters, as Luke sets the scene, he's not even introduced Jesus of Nazareth yet, but he's set up a lot of expectations. He's set up the idea of a Jewish God who keeps his promises. And so before we meet Jesus the man, he introduces another man, a man called John. John, who's been wandering around the River Jordan in the first century in this country called Israel, in the shadow of the Roman Empire, and he's been trying to shake up the Jewish people. He's been telling them they need to turn around, to come back, to not be sucked into the empire machine. He wanted them to remember who they are, that they're God's people, God's children, God's partners. And he gets a huge response. Crowds and crowds come and hear what he's saying, and then they ask to be immersed in the river as a sign that they do want to turn around and to come back and to be who they were made to be. In fact, they wonder if John is somebody that God had always intended to send to actually help to sort things out, somebody they've been waiting for. A lot of Luke's story is about how people respond, and they respond in their crowds, but as the crowds come, they actually have a question, a really great question. And the question is, what should we do then? What should we do then? It's one of the most basic questions of being a human being. It's a question that you don't have to have if you're just working on instinct as an animal. You just do what's next, but human beings are made to be choice makers, and that comes with a privilege of being able to make a choice, but a huge responsibility. And how many times have I thought, won't somebody just please tell me what to do? Tell me what to do. What should we do then? John, back there in the first century, could have been really vague in his answer. He could have said, well, it's up to you now. I've told you the basics. I've told you who you are. Now you have to put it into practice. You have to decide. But he doesn't say that. What he says is, anyone who has 2 shirts should share one with people who have none. Anyone who has food should do the same. Oh, lots of people have pondered, what does he mean? Here's this story about this man and the kind of advice he's giving. What is a spiritual lesson we can learn from this? What kind of moral and ethical principles can we draw out that would help us to decipher this ancient meaning? There's a thinker, a writer called Soren Kierkegaard, and he once wrote that, in his opinion, all the fancy discussions about the Bible, what we call theology in universities and in loads and loads of books discussions we've taken part in and that we've read, he said all of this is mostly, in his idea, just a really clever way for human beings to try and ignore having to deal with what the Bible actually says and what that might mean. I think he's got a point. What's John saying in the first century is that his Roman Empire listeners, if they have 2 shirts, they should share them with somebody who doesn't have any. Now, sometimes it's hard to see how an ancient Jewish story has anything to do with us here in 2021. I suppose one way of thinking about this story is to say that this only applies to people who have more than 1 shirt. That's me. And that's you. And you. I don't know every single one of you, but I've a fair idea that you all have more than 1 shirt. This applies to us. It's not difficult to understand, it's not confusing, it's not vague. John's saying the implication of what he's saying about who they are is that they should share the stuff they have more than enough of with those who don't have enough. Why? You might think this book is full of instructions about how to behave, how to get into God's good book, how to get into the club, but what these stories reveal, what John's revealing, what in fact Jesus of Nazareth will reveal more than anyone, is actually the opposite. What is revealed is that all of us, not just the Jews, all of us are God's children, are God's people. And this is how God's children act. They don't have to behave to be God's children, to be God's partners, to get into a club. They are in the family already. And the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus is going to be a huge part of what makes that real. But God's people, God's partners, don't let other people go without clothes and without food. We are all made, whoever we are, to look after each other. It's what we get to do. And these crowds that are turning back and remembering who they are, this is what John wants them to remember. This is what God's people do. This is what God's partners do. This is what we are made for. Even tax collectors and soldiers were coming to John. What he was talking about made sense deeply to all sorts of people. The soldiers he talks about were probably actually Jewish soldiers. They would have worked for the temple system, sort of like guards. And then the tax collectors, the toll collectors, were actually some of the most despised people of the time. The way the Roman Empire worked was it just wanted money and profit and control. And so it sold off the rights to collect the taxes. There was a certain quota that the Romans needed, but the people who then bid in for the opportunity to do that, they could take a profit. They needed to make a living, obviously, but most of the time they then extorted even more out of the already beaten down Jewish population. Tax collectors were seen as collaborators, as greedy criminals. And Luke wants to know that even they are included in what God is saying. God wants everyone to come back to who they were made to be. And so they ask the same question, the soldiers and the tax collectors, what should we do then? John's answer is just as simple. Don't collect more than you're required to. The Greek actually says, literally, don't shake anyone. Don't extort people. Don't abuse your position for personal gain, or to oppress, or to cause hurt to anyone. It's the same for the soldiers. It's interesting. He's not telling everyone to get to the synagogue more, to pray more, to read the Bible more. He's not telling them to turn their back on everything to do with the empire around and then to wander around in the desert beside the river like him, immersing people. Instead, he's telling them that wherever they are, whatever role they're in, they can act like God's children, God's people, God's partners, who they were made to be. He says, be a decent tax collector. Be a decent soldier. Be the person God made you to be where you are. Look after the people entrusted to your care. The only place you can make a difference, the only place I can make a difference is where I am with the people beside me, the people entrusted to my care. The crowds get stirred up by this and they start to ask if John is someone called the Messiah. This is the one that they hoped would come and bring a revolution. John gets that idea out of the way really quick. He says, no, I'm pointing to someone else. And Luke has already set up exactly who this is. It's Jesus of Nazareth. Someone who says is going to be so much more than what he is all about himself, John. He's pointing to Jesus. He's not even fit to tie Jesus' sandals. Jesus, or the one coming, is not just going to immerse people in the river as a sign of them coming back. He's actually going to immerse them in the Spirit, in God's presence, and there'll be a huge change in their lives and their relationships. John, we're told by Luke, and he's careful in his language, uses all sorts of ways to get across this good news. I think Luke, as a writer, is kind of joking when he says this. He calls it good news. But news about a God who's keeping his promises, who's sorting things out, who's calling people back to be who they were made to be, and wanting them to be less interested in their own selfish wants and more interested in caring for the people around about them, is actually not good news for everyone. Including, and at the end, before he introduces Jesus onto the stage, Luke wants us to know, including the current ruler or fake ruler, Herod Antipas, who everyone knew then about the gossip around him. The gossip that he had an affair with his brother's wife, and then he'd convinced his brother's wife to divorce his brother, and then he had then married Herodias, all of which is completely against Jewish law. So much of Luke's story, as I've said, is about how people respond. The crowds respond. They ask questions. They throw themselves into what John is talking about. Herod responds the other way. He tries to stop John. He puts him in prison. He wants to stop this message. It makes him uncomfortable. He doesn't want to hear who he was made to be, because he might have to change to remember what he's supposed to be all about. But Luke's story is not over. Remember, it's a story about a God who keeps his promises, who is at work, who is sorting things out, and it's about a movement, a project that cannot be stopped, even by Herod. And so this story moves on, but the question hangs there. What should we do then?